In the bitter cold of a fading winter evening, the last train whistled its way out of Dust Creek Station, its echo fading into the white emptiness of the Wyoming plains. The air was heavy with snow, each flake drifting slowly under the dim gas lamps that flickered on the wooden platform. As the wheels screeched and the engine disappeared into the horizon, a strange stillness took its place, one that seemed to swallow every sound, every heartbeat. In that stillness stood a woman, her coat thin against the cold, her arms clutching a small bundle to her chest. Her face was pale and weary, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from too much heartbreak. She had been there for hours, watching each passenger depart, her eyes scanning the faces that never once looked back at her. The child in her arms stirred and let out a soft whimper as she pulled the blanket closer, whispering gentle words meant as much for herself as for the baby. Behind her, the station clerk shuffled papers at his desk, glancing up occasionally with a mix of curiosity and pity. When he finally approached her to ask her name, his voice carried a hesitant kindness, but her answer left him stunned. She looked down at the child, then back at the empty tracks, and said quietly, "I don't have one anymore." Her name had once meant something. It had been whispered with love, written in letters, called out in laughter, but that was before her world had come undone. Her father had been a preacher, stern and proud, who believed in sin and salvation with equal fire. When she told him she was with child, his eyes went cold, his voice harder than stone. "You'll leave this house," he said, "and you'll take your shame with you." The man who had promised to love her, to build a home to get her out west, had vanished before she could even tell him. One letter returned unopened. Another never answered. And so she came alone, following the last hope she had, that maybe, just maybe, he would be waiting at Dust Creek Station like he said he would. But as the final train vanished, she knew he never would. Snow began to fall heavier, gathering in her hair and on her lashes. The baby whimpered again, and she rocked him softly, whispering that everything would be fine even though she didn't believe it. She was hungry, exhausted, and utterly lost. The small town stretched silent beyond the station, a scattering of dimly lit buildings and a saloon where laughter rose and fell like wind through empty windows. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, the judgment, the curiosity, the whispers that would come when morning arrived. She thought of leaving, of walking until her feet gave way, but there was nowhere left to go. The station clock struck 8, its chime echoing through the emptiness. She sat down on the wooden bench, pressing the baby close to her chest for warmth. The lantern light flickered over her face, and for a moment she thought she saw someone move through the snow. A tall figure, walking slowly, a coat drawn tight against the wind. His steps were deliberate, steady, the sound of boots crunching over ice. She didn't look up at first, didn't want to believe that anyone would come near her. But the footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and she heard a voice, low and calm, asking if she needed help. She raised her head and met his eyes, dark, quiet, and unreadable. His face was marked by years of weather and silence, the kind of man who had seen too much to waste words. A small scar traced the edge of his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his coat. He said nothing more, but after a long moment, he removed the scar from his neck and placed it gently over her shoulders. The warmth of the wool startled her, as if she had forgotten what kindness felt like. She wanted to thank him, but no words came out. The man looked at the baby, then back at her. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his tone more observation than rebuke. "Do you have a place to go?" She shook her head slowly, unable to hide the tremble in her lips. The wind howled through the station, and she whispered the truth she had held back from everyone else. "He left us. I have no name." The man's expression softened just a little. He studied her for a long time, as though weighing something deep inside himself. Then he spoke 3 simple words that would stay with her forever. "You do now." She didn't understand what he meant at first. Those words hung in the air, carried by the cold and the quiet. He didn't explain them, didn't offer pity or promise. He simply extended a gloved hand, helping her to her feet, and guided her toward the waiting horse tied by the fence. She hesitated, unsure she could trust him, but something in his eyes, something solid and unshaken, made her follow. As they walked through the snow, the town lights dimmed behind them until only the moonlight remained, silvering the trees and the long road ahead. The baby stirred again, and she looked down at the small face nestled against her chest. For the first time that night, she felt a strange flicker of hope, fragile but real. She didn't know where this stranger was taking her, didn't know his name or his story, but there was a steadiness in his presence that felt live, but there was a steadiness in his presence that felt live very felt. Behind them, Dust Creek Station faded into the distance. The clerk watched from the window as the two figures disappeared into the storm, and though he never knew their names, he would tell the story for years to come, the night when a nameless woman found warmth in the middle of nowhere, and a silent man gave her something far greater than words. The snow fell endlessly, erasing footprints, blurring lines between past and future. But somewhere out there on that frozen road, a woman who had been lost began to find herself again, not through promises or pity, but through the quiet mercy of a stranger who spoke only when it mattered. And those three words, carried by the wind, would come to define everything that followed. You do now?
The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows of the small cabin, illuminating a space that was both humble and warm. The fire had burned low during the night, but its faint glow still lingered, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor. She awoke to the sound of the wind brushing against the walls and the distant call of crows outside. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, a stranger's voice, the slow rhythm of horse hooves, and the feeling of being guided somewhere safe when she had thought she might freeze to death. But then she felt the gentle rise and fall of the small bundle against her chest and remembered everything. Her baby was sleeping peacefully, wrapped snugly in a quilt that wasn't hers. The room smelled faintly of pine and smoke, and though it was modest, a simple bed, a small table, and a shelf lined with tools, it felt like the first real shelter she had known in months. When she sat up, she noticed a folded blanket draped across her legs and a steaming cup of tea placed carefully by her side. The man from the night before was nowhere to be seen, though his presence seemed to fill the air around her. She sipped the tea, feeling warmth spread through her body, chasing away the ache in her bones. It was the first thing she had tasted in over a day, and with each swallow, she felt life creeping back into her limbs. When the door finally creaked open, she looked up, startled, but the man only gave her a nod before stepping inside, shaking the snow from his coat. His face was calm, unreadable as before, and when their eyes met, she felt the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through the night. That he didn't ask questions, didn't pry into her past or the baby's. Instead, he simply set down a loaf of bread and a few apples on the table, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She tried to thank him, but her voice faltered. He waved off her words, saying softly, "Eat first. You can talk later." It wasn't unkind, it was practical, grounded, like everything about him. So she ate in silence, her eyes flickering between him and the child in her arms. As the hours passed, she began to notice things about him, the way his hands bore small scars, the way he moved quietly, as if careful not to disturb the stillness around him. He seemed to belong to the wilderness, to the solitude of the mountains and the snow. There were no signs of anyone else living there, no woman's belongings, no extra coat by the door, just the signs of a man who lived alone and had done so for a long time. When she finally found her voice, she asked his name. He hesitated for a moment before saying simply, "Elias." The name fit him, solid, unembellished, like a stone worn smooth by years of weather. She introduced herself quietly, almost ashamed of the sound of her own name after so long being unwanted. He nodded once, as though to acknowledge it not just as a name, but as something he intended to remember. Days passed, and she began to settle into a strange rhythm. Elias would rise before dawn and leave to work outside, cutting wood, checking traps, tending to the small stable near the edge of the property. She stayed inside, caring for the baby, cleaning, trying to make herself useful. He never asked her to. But it gave her a sense of purpose again, a reason to move beyond survival. She found herself watching him sometimes through the window, the way he moved through the snow with steady precision. He was a man of few words, but there was a gentleness in the way he spoke to his horse, in the way he always made sure the fire was burning strong before night fell. One evening, as the wind howled outside and snow drifted thick against the glass, she asked him why he had helped her. He was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "Because someone once did the same for me." He didn't say more than that, but she could see something flicker in his eyes, an old pain, perhaps, or a memory buried deep. It made her wonder what kind of loss had brought him here, to a cabin miles from anyone, where silence was his only companion. The baby began to grow stronger, sleeping longer, crying less. Elias built a small cradle from leftover wood, sanding it smooth and placing it near the hearth. When he handed it to her, she didn't know what to say. Her eyes filled with tears, and though she tried to hide them, he noticed. "A child should have a place to rest," he said simply. Those words, so plain and sincere, carried more kindness than anything she had heard in years. Winter deepened, and with it, a strange comfort grew between them. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer awkward. It became something shared, something that didn't need to be filled. She began to help him with small tasks, mending clothes, preparing meals, feeding the animals. At night, after the baby was asleep, they would sit by the fire. He would whittle wood or repair tools while she watched the flames dance across the walls. She found herself telling him things she hadn't spoken aloud before, the dreams she once had, the man who had left her, the shame she carried from her father's house. He listened without judgment, his eyes steady, his expression calm. When she faltered, he didn't comfort her with empty words. He simply said, "You're here now. That's what matters." Those words began to change something inside her. For the first time in months, she started to believe that maybe she wasn't ruined, that maybe life hadn't ended the night she was cast out. Elias never treated her as someone to be pitied. He treated her as if she were capable, as if she still had a place in the world. The snow began to melt slowly as spring approached. The air softened, the ground turned to mud, and new shoots of green began to break through the earth. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge of desperation, it began to feel like home. She laughed again, quietly at first, then more easily. She saw it surprise him sometimes, the sound of it, and though he didn't say anything, there was a warmth in his gaze she hadn't noticed before. One morning, as sunlight poured through the window, she looked at her reflection in a small mirror. The woman who stared back wasn't the same one who had stood freezing at the train station. Her eyes were no longer hollow. Her shoulders no longer sagged under the weight of shame. She was still scarred, still healing, but she was whole again in ways she hadn't thought possible, and as she turned to look at Elias standing by the door, his hand steady on the frame, she realized something she had been too afraid to admit: the stranger who had once saved her life had become part of it. The man who had given her shelter had given her something far greater: dignity, peace, and a quiet kind of love that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She would never forget that her story had begun in the cold, but it was here, in this cabin, with this man and her child, that she finally began to live. The first true spring in Dust Creek came quietly, not with fanfare or thunder, but with the slow, steady melt of snow from the eaves and the whisper of rivers returning to life. The valley that had once been wrapped in silence and sorrow began to hum again. Birds returned to the cedar branches outside the cabin, their songs uncertain at first, as though testing the air. The ground softened underfoot, releasing the scent of pine and damp earth. For Jane, the world itself seemed to breathe differently now, less like survival, more like belonging. Her days no longer felt borrowed. They felt earned. Each morning, she rose with the light, feeding the baby and tending to the small garden she had planted behind the cabin. It was nothing more than a patch of earth with sprouts barely reaching past her ankle, but it was hers. Every seed pressed into the soil felt like a declaration that she had roots now. Elias, as steady as ever, worked beside her in the fields or the barn. He had built new fences through the thaw, repaired the roof, and replaced the old stove with one that burned hotter. He never spoke much, but she had come to understand his language: the way he would nod once after she finished a task, the faint curve of his mouth when she laughed, the way his gaze softened when he looked at her and the child together. In the evenings, the world turned golden. The wind would sweep gently through the open door, carrying the scent of fresh grass and wood smoke. She would sit on the porch with the baby in her lap, watching Elias in the fading light as he worked with his hands, mending a bridle, sharpening a blade, whittling wood into quiet shapes that she often found later on the windowsill. He never told her what they were for. But she always knew. Small tokens of care, left where she would see them. The town, too, began to notice her. The same people who once turned away now nodded when she passed. When she went into the general store for flour or thread, the shopkeeper no longer stared with judgment but asked about the child, remarking that he was growing fast. Dust Creek was not a place that forgot quickly, but it did soften with time, and her quiet endurance had earned a kind of respect that words could never have demanded. It wasn't charity. It was acceptance. That acceptance grew stronger when she began teaching. The idea had come one evening when she saw a group of children playing by the creek, their laughter sharp and wild, but their words uncertain. They couldn't read. They had never been taught. That night, she brought it up to Elias, her voice hesitant, afraid it might sound foolish. But he only looked at her and said, "You should." 2 words, simple as always, but they changed everything. Within a month, she had cleared out the old church that stood at the edge of town. Its pews were broken, its floor warped from years of neglect, but its bones were strong. She scrubbed the walls, mended what she could, and borrowed slates and chalk from the store. By the first day of summer, the old church was filled with voices again, children reciting letters, stumbling over words, giggling at their mistakes. Jane stood at the front, her hands covered in chalk dust, her heart full. For the first time since she'd left her father's home, she wasn't running from anything. She was building something. Elias didn't say much about her work, but he was always there. Sometimes she'd see him outside the schoolhouse, fixing the steps or painting the door, pretending he had business nearby. Once, when she finished a lesson and turned around, she found a sign carved in his unmistakable handwriting. It read, "Miss Jane Avery, Schoolmistress." She touched the letters with trembling fingers. That name, her name, felt heavier and truer than any she had ever carried. Her nights were quieter now, but they no longer felt empty. She would sit by the fire after the baby fell asleep, reading from the few books she had gathered from the townsfolk. Elias would sometimes join her, sitting across the room, his eyes half closed as she read aloud. He liked the stories, though he never said so. His silence was not absence, it was listening. It was understanding. In that silence, she felt seen in a way that words could never reach. Time moved differently in the mountains. The days stretched long, the nights folded softly. The baby, her son, had begun to walk, his small steps unsteady but determined. Each time he fell, Elias would reach down without a word and set him upright again. Jane would watch them from the doorway, her chest full to the point of ache. The child who had once been born into shame was growing up surrounded by strength and tenderness. He would never know the coldness of being unwanted. There were still moments when the past returned to her in flashes, the echo of her father's voice, the sting of that final sermon, the sound of the train pulling away as she was left behind. But those memories no longer controlled her. They came and went like shadows crossing sunlight, present, but powerless. She had replaced them with new memories, gentler ones, the smell of bread baking in the morning, the warmth of Elias's coat draped over her shoulders, the laughter of her students as they chased each other down the hill point one evening, near the end of summer. The sky turned the color of amber honey. Jane sat on the porch swing, a book open on her lap, though she wasn't reading. Elias poured 2 cups of tea, setting one beside her. He handed her the baby, now half asleep, his tiny hands clutching at her shawl. They sat together in the stillness, the sound of crickets rising from the fields that he didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried weight. "Long day?" he asked. She smiled softly, brushing a curl of hair from her face. "The Mallister boy finally learned to write his name," she said. "Took him 2 weeks, but he looked like he'd caught a star." Elias glanced down at the baby, who stirred and sighed, then looked back at her with something like quiet pride. "He'll write his name too," he said. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I reckon he will." They didn't need to say more. The silence that followed was full of everything they had built: trust, resilience, a love unspoken yet deeply understood. It was not the kind of love that burned fast and bright, it was the kind that settled into the bones, patient and enduring. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he took her hand, rough palm against soft skin. As the sun dipped below the ridge, turning the sky to molten gold, Jane looked out over the land. Once, it had been nothing but dust and departure, a place where she had lost everything. Now it was home. The porch creaked beneath them, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled against the fading light. She looked at Elias, then at the child sleeping peacefully in her arms. Once, she had been nameless, cast out, unseen. Now she was Jane Avery, teacher, mother, and the woman who had learned to rebuild her life from the ashes of ruin. Her past no longer defined her. What defined her now was this: the man beside her who had chosen her without words, the child who gave her a reason to wake each morning, and the small, steady life they had built together in the quiet corner of a wild world. And as the last light faded, she whispered to no one in particular, "I was lost once." Elias's thumb brushed across her knuckles in quiet answer. "Not anymore," he murmured. In that moment, the world felt whole. The wind softened, the stars began to appear, and the woman who once waited at a train station with no name finally understood what it meant to be found.